Welcome back to Hiking with Anderson. I'm out here by a creek, and so I know this one's going to be a little noisy, but I thought it'd still be a nice place to film our new series, or the first episode of our new series on critical theory. You might have heard of critical theory before, and especially maybe in the news, in political articles, or about education boards fighting over critical theory in the curriculum. What I want to do is look at it not so much from a political perspective as a philosophical perspective, since I'm a philosopher. And it just so happens that this summer I'm doing research at a center for the study of Western civilization. But then I'm also involved in working around decolonizing the curriculum. So how do both of those go together? How do we study Western civilization? And what does it mean to decolonizing the curriculum? All of that will come into what is critical theory. So for this video, I want to just look at three things. What is critical theory first? And critical theory, in philosophical terms, we date this to Immanuel Kant, the philosopher Kant, and his critical philosophy. So what critical philosophy does is asks, what are the necessary conditions for blank? In Kant's case, it was knowledge. What are the necessary conditions for knowledge? But critical theory takes that same kind of approach and says, well, what are the necessary conditions? What's the structure of a society? What power structures keep it in play? And then, this goes to step two, what do we do about it? So, first step, critical philosophy and critical theory. Now, what's interesting is it sometimes gets connected up with the idea of critical thinking. And I like critical thinking. I teach critical thinking to my students, but it really becomes a kind of a buzzword. And we need to ask, what is critical thinking? What exactly are you talking about when you say critical thinking? In this case, critical thinking means exposing power relations. In my case, and I think really what Kant was doing, is critical thinking means looking at the assumptions, the presuppositions of a worldview. So we're actually going to do critical thinking about critical theory in this series. And we're going to expose the assumptions or presuppositions of critical theory. Now, the second point is critical theory says that we need to expose, lay bare, get out in the open, the power structures that make society work or go, and show how they're based on essentially selfishness. And there's some insight there, right? When people get into power, they tend to use their power in a way to preserve power for themselves and others, to preserve wealth for themselves and others. So there's some insight in that, but as we'll see in the next point, critical theory reduces everything just to power. That's it. So the second point, exposing power relationships. Now, when we look at power relationships, what we'll see is the concern is especially about using power to get wealth, to make life easier for yourself and your group. And usually you do it by exploiting other people. So there's the oppressed and the oppressor. And the oppressor uses the oppressed to make their life easier. And that's what critical theory wants to expose. That's the second point we're looking at today. Now, I want you to keep this in mind for future episodes, which is what the oppressor, if this theory is true, is trying to do is decrease their suffering. And so critical theory is a theory about why there's suffering. And it said it's because of oppression, which is to say it's mostly just looking at economic and political suffering, strife between people, which can be affected by economics. And that's only a small part of suffering. And what we want to do is figure out, why is there suffering at all? What's the origin of suffering? What purpose does it serve? Not simply look at how has it been used within a society. All right, so then the third point is, critical theory says power is, or truth is power. Whoever's in charge, they determine what the society thinks is true. In other words, there is no truth. There's just whoever's in charge. And this group has been using their power incorrectly to oppress others, so they should be removed, and another group can have their turn at being in power. Well, you see, that's just kind of skepticism. Philosophical skepticism, which says knowledge is not possible. Sorry, I'm going to adjust this here. I'm out here, I'm hiking. This is raw, so I know it's a bit shaky. There's only power, no truth. But of course, here's the self-referential absurdity of that view. That view claims that it's true, and that it is the one that should be used and be in power, and should be used to affect what gets done. So we can't help avoid the idea of truth. We can't avoid the idea of truth by saying, well, there's your truth and my truth. No, there's just truth. There's not truths or the many truths, because even that claim then itself is a claim about truth. So first point today was, what is critical theory? Second point is, what does critical theory do, which is try to expose power relations? And the third point is that critical theory reduces everything to power, and in doing that, it overlooks the category of truth to its own detriment. And I'm going to pick up on all three of these as we're going, but especially that last one in future episodes about critical theory. So thanks for joining me as we begin another series of Hiking with Anderson.